Hey, everybody, this is TJR.
And this is Robert Kinsler.
And so today is Friday, the 28th, as we record this. And the news broke today. Jerry Lee Lewis, one of rock and roll's last original pioneers, passed away today. It is interesting to mention that just a few days prior, his, how shall I say, management, his press relations had to dispel a rumor that he was dead earlier in the week, and basically had to really suppress it. I mean, saying, no, Jerry Lee Lewis is still alive. And that was earlier in the week. And then, of course, today they announced that he had passed away. No exact cause has been given, but he was in very frail health.
He was.
And he was 87. Is that right, Robert? He was 87?
Right. He was 87, exactly.
Yeah. Several years back, there was an album that he released called Last Man Standing. That basically got its title from the fact that out of all the Sun recording artists, the legendary Sun recording artists that came out of Sun Studios, this would include artists like Elvis Presley, Johnny Cash, Roy Orbison, Carl Perkins, the list goes on. But that out of all of these, he was basically the last man standing.
He was, exactly.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
So anyways, though, we just wanted to take a moment here on the channel and just briefly reflect on the passing of Jerry Lee Lewis. And Robert, any thoughts you'd like to share?
Yeah, I do, because back in 2000, which sounds like very long ago, but at that time, Jerry Lee Lewis wasn't all that much older than I am today, which is obviously very, telling. But anyway, I got to see him at the Galaxy Concert Theater in Santa Ana.
Yeah.
I was assigned to review him. So my wife and I went to see him. He performed for about an hour. He didn't get on the piano and do all the crazy dynamics that he had done back in the 50s, but he was very good. His voice sounded good. He covered Chuck Berry. He did a beautiful version of Somewhere Over the Rainbow. Of course, he did some of his own original songs that everybody knows, like Great Balls of Fire and stuff. But so I am thankful I got to see him. He did. That was a very strong show. I didn't get to see him more recently, like at Stagecoach in 2017. But there, people said he only played about a half hour, and he wasn't as strong in his later years. And he, like you mentioned, TJ, he was dealing with some poor health and everything. But I'm glad he got to live long enough, and so many of the people that he influenced in the Rolling Stones and in the Beatles and stuff got to pay tribute to him, and at least he lived long enough to know that he is really appreciated by so many in the rock and roll community.
Yes. I should mention just real quick, and it's a common, I think, mistake that a lot of people think that Jerry Lee Lewis wrote Great Balls of Fire. He actually didn't. It was actually written by Otis Blackwell and Jack Hammer. But don't worry about it. I just wanted to say that because we're talking off the cuff here. It's
right, exactly.
Conversation, and it's just a common mistake. People think that he wrote that. But
yeah,
so I just want to say that before the trolls, attack us and say otherwise. Don't worry about it. Anyway, but I wanted to correct that here. Yeah. No.
But I know people associate that song.
Oh yeah. That song has become synonymous with with him.
Exactly.
When I think about Jerry Lee Lewis, of course, his life certainly had its controversies. I really think of him as kind of rock and roll's basically first bad boy. The first real rock and roll bad boy who didn't exactly try to hide that fact. And lived a pretty, led a pretty wild lifestyle, and yet managed to outlive all of his contemporaries, oddly enough.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Really amazing, actually.
That sounds, but managed to outlive them all. One of the pioneers of rock and roll, one of its first bad boys. And of course, he had the distinction of being the fact that rock and roll being very guitar led during that time period, yet he was the first one to really come bursting out with the piano. And,
Right.
which
Right.
of course inspired a whole slew of rock pianists as well. And
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
but
You always think of Jerry Lee Lewis and Little Richard as like the two
yeah,
first, keyboard piano heroes.
the piano thumpers.
I mean, you had Chuck Berry as a guitar hero, and you had
Yeah.
Buddy Holly, kind of really so important in the development of rhythm guitar and kind of like dynamic rhythms and how those added to the songs that he wrote. But yeah, you're right. I mean, Jerry Lee Lewis in all ways was a true original, and just his dynamic personality that was so, outrageous for the time,
Yeah.
made him someone that no one could forget.
Yeah, and just like who you mentioned, Little Richard, and of course Elvis Presley, one of those electrifying showmen who would inspire everybody, moving forward, from Pete Townsend with his windmill guitar to Ted Nugent, swinging on a rope, Kiss with their wild stage antics, just every type of wild, crazy performers. You trace it back to performers like the ones we've just talked about, and that includes Jerry Lee Lewis as well, of course.
Yeah.
But
and one thing I think we should, TJ, one thing we should mention before, because otherwise we may not think about it is, because bands like the Beatles and the Stones, they kind of pushed aside some of the early rock heroes in the 60s. Mm-hmm. So he actually went on to score some hits in country music in the 1960s and early 1970s. That's when he kind of established himself in the music world and became kind of a hero to country music fans. So it speaks to his level of greatness and his powers as a vocalist to do that. So
he reinvented himself.
Yeah, and if anyone wants to check those out, just a couple songs you might want to hear from him in the country genres. What's Made Milwaukee Famous, and then in parentheses, Has Made a Loser Out of Me, and then also She Still Comes Around. So these were among the songs that he scored in the country music field.
Yeah, there were also some comeback albums that he did in the latter half of the first decade of the 21st century, and in the early half of the second decade of the 21st century, where he kind of had a little bit of a comeback, not maybe in his old age, not quite maybe as huge as say like Johnny Cash did, but right. In the same way in that he worked with a specific producer, and they followed kind of a formula where they teamed him up with a lot of guest stars like Keith Richards, Bruce Springsteen, Jimmy Page,
right.
and he did duet covers on the first two, one which was called The Last Man Standing, and the other, which I mentioned earlier, and the other one entitled Mean Old Man, which the title track had him with Chris Christopherson. And then there was one final album, and that album was called Rock and Roll Time. And that last album, while it did have a lot of guest stars on it, they were just musician guest stars. And this included, once again, like Keith Richards, Neil Young, to name a few. But it was just him at the forefront on piano and vocals. And the only vocal duet on that album was one with Shelby Lynne, and that was it. And so there were these late career albums that he did where he did a little bit of a comeback, in the final stages of his life. And those were, as far as I know, those were the last studio albums. There have been some later releases after that, but they've all been just earlier concert recordings, some of them going back to the 80s and such, released for the first time. But those were the last three studio albums. And those albums are out there. And it's funny, you can listen to like the last one, Rock and Roll Time. And he still has a certain spirit to him. Even at that advanced age, even at that point, he still has there's just a certain undeniable spirit to those recordings. And so I would recommend checking those out too, if you get a chance.
And the last thing I might want to say, TJ, before perhaps you make any closing thoughts is, in 1986, Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry, and others, he was in that inaugural class in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And I'm glad, despite some of the controversies and stuff like that, they did not hold him back and that he got in, because
Mhm.
especially now after all these years, you do realize how important he was, and you do hear his influence in those greats that came after him. So, and on the Twitterverse today, you saw that a lot of the acknowledgments from whether it was
Yeah.
Ringo Starr and Paul McCartney or Mick Jagger, and then you saw the images of him with Fats Domino and other greats from those handles, and you can see what a large shadow he cast in the world, and it is nice to see him getting the love today, because I think despite the controversies and some of the, like you said, the wildness in his own life, his music is what he will be remembered for, and I think it's really deserving of that.
Absolutely, I agree. So with that, we'll just say thank you so much for watching, and please share with us your thoughts on the passing of Jerry Lee Lewis and his music. And everybody, thank you so much for watching. And Robert, thanks for joining me here.
Hey, good to
And
see you, TJ.
good to see you too. And we'll see you all in the next video, everybody. Take care and hope you all stay safe and healthy. Bye-bye.